In emergency medicine, the cases that reshape how you think are rarely the ones involving conditions you have never seen before. They are the ones involving conditions you see constantly, approached from an angle you had not previously considered. A patient comes in with a presentation you have managed 100 times, and something in the history, something in the detail of how their day unfolded before the acute event, makes you see the entire pathophysiology differently. That is what happened when I began paying serious attention to meal sequencing, to the specific order in which different food components are consumed within a single meal, and to the evidence that has accumulated around it over the past decade. Not what people eat, not how much. The order, the sequence, which component of the meal arrives in the digestive tract first, and what that seemingly minor timing decision does to the glucose response of the entire meal that follows. This is not a fringe idea supported by a handful of small studies and amplified by wellness culture. It is a mechanistically coherent, increasingly well-replicated finding from peer-reviewed metabolic research, with practical implications that are immediate, cost-free, and applicable to virtually every meal consumed by virtually every person, regardless of what that meal contains. It does not require dietary substitution, caloric restriction, supplementation, or any change to the foods being eaten at all. It requires only a change to the sequence in which they are eaten, and the effect on postprandial glucose, the blood sugar spike that follows eating, is by any reasonable clinical standard remarkable. To understand why sequence matters, and why the evidence behind it is considerably more compelling than its current public profile would suggest, it is necessary first to understand something specific about the gastrointestinal and hormonal architecture through which a meal is processed, because the mechanism here is not vague or speculative. It is anatomically precise, and once it is understood, the logic of food sequencing becomes not just plausible, but almost self-evident. When food enters the stomach, it does not sit passively awaiting uniform digestion. The stomach processes and releases its contents into the small intestine in a sequence that is influenced significantly by the physical and chemical properties of what it received, and the small intestine responds to the arrival of different macronutrients with different hormonal signals, different rates of glucose absorption, and different degrees of activation of the regulatory mechanisms that determine how high blood sugar will rise and how quickly insulin will need to respond. The critical structure in this context is the proximal small intestine, the first portion of the small intestine to receive gastric contents, and specifically its response to different macronutrients arriving at its surface. When carbohydrate arrives at the proximal small intestine, the digestive enzymes already present rapidly break it down into glucose, which is absorbed directly into the portal circulation and delivered to the liver, and subsequently the systemic bloodstream. The rate of this process is fast, particularly with refined or low-fiber carbohydrates, and the resulting blood glucose elevation is the postprandial spike that is the central metabolic event we are concerned with. When protein or fat arrives at the proximal small intestine before carbohydrate, a different sequence of events is initiated. Protein stimulates the release of several hormones from the gut wall, including glucagon-like peptide 1 or GLP-1 and peptide YY, that collectively slow gastric emptying, reduce the rate at which subsequent food components are delivered to the small intestine, and directly stimulate insulin secretion in anticipation of incoming glucose. Fat, arriving first, similarly slows gastric emptying and stimulates cholecystokinin release, which further delays gastric transit and reduces the speed at which the carbohydrate portion of the meal eventually reaches the absorptive surface of the small intestine. Fiber, particularly soluble fiber consumed before carbohydrate, forms a viscous layer in the intestinal lumen that physically impedes glucose absorption by reducing the contact between glucose and the intestinal wall. The net effect of consuming protein, fat, or fiber before carbohydrate, as opposed to consuming carbohydrate first or in an undifferentiated mix, is a physiological preparation of the gastrointestinal tract and the hormonal environment that meaningfully moderates the glucose absorption event when carbohydrate eventually arrives. The spike is lower, the insulin response is smaller and better timed. The postprandial glucose curve is shallower and resolves more rapidly. Not because the meal is different, but because the sequence in which its components arrived changed the biological context in which each was processed. The foundational clinical research on food sequencing and postprandial glucose was conducted by Dr. Alpana Shukla and colleagues at Weill Cornell Medicine, and the results, published in Diabetes Care in 2015 and subsequently replicated and extended in follow-up studies, are specific enough in their findings to constitute actionable clinical guidance. In the original study, participants with type 2 diabetes consumed identical meals on separate occasions, with the only variable being the order in which the meal's components were eaten. When carbohydrate was consumed first, followed by protein and vegetables, postprandial glucose peaked at levels consistent with the expected response to a mixed meal in a diabetic population. When the sequence was reversed, vegetables and protein consumed first, carbohydrate consumed last. Postprandial glucose was reduced by approximately 37% at 30 minutes post-meal, 25% at 60 minutes, and remained significantly lower across the full 2-hour measurement period. Insulin levels showed a corresponding attenuation, indicating that the glucose reduction was not simply a consequence of accelerated insulin release, but of genuinely reduced glucose absorption rate. A follow-up study by the same group, published in BMJ Open Diabetes Research and Care in 2019, extended the investigation to individuals with prediabetes and healthy controls, examining not only the order of protein versus carbohydrate, but the specific role of vegetables consumed prior to carbohydrate. The findings were consistent across all three groups. The glucose-reducing effect of consuming vegetables and protein before carbohydrate was observed in healthy individuals, in those with prediabetes, and in those with established type 2 diabetes, with effect sizes that were, in the researcher's own description, comparable to pharmacological interventions targeting postprandial glucose. The sequence effect was not confined to a metabolically compromised subgroup. It was a fundamental feature of gastrointestinal physiology, operating across the full spectrum of metabolic health. Research from a separate group, published in the European Journal of Nutrition, added an important further dimension by examining the effect of vinegar, specifically the acetic acid it contains, consumed before a carbohydrate-containing meal. Acetic acid reduces the activity of the enzyme amylase, which is responsible for the initial breakdown of starch into glucose in the digestive tract, and it also slows gastric emptying. Studies found that consuming a small quantity of apple cider vinegar or wine vinegar dissolved in water before a carbohydrate-containing meal reduced postprandial glucose responses by between 19 and 34% across multiple studies, a finding that mechanistically aligns with the food sequencing research and extends the principle beyond solid food sequencing to pre-meal liquid interventions. The question that naturally follows from the above is straightforward. If the effect size is this significant, if the mechanism is this well understood, and if the intervention is this simple and cost-free, why is food sequencing not a standard component of dietary counseling for every patient with insulin resistance, prediabetes, or type 2 diabetes? Why is it not discussed in routine consultations? Why do most people with metabolic conditions have no awareness of it? The answer reflects something important about how nutritional science is translated, or fails to be translated, into clinical practice and public health communication. Nutritional research that does not attach to a commercial product, a pharmaceutical compound, or a dramatically countercultural dietary framework tends to travel slowly and incompletely from academic publication to the consultation room. There is no financial infrastructure supporting the dissemination of a finding whose primary implication is to eat your salad before your pasta. There is no supplement, no device, no subscription service, no branded program through which the insight can be packaged and promoted. It exists in the research literature cited by specialists in metabolic medicine and discussed with increasing frequency in academic contexts. But the pathway from there to the general public is slow, uneven, and dependent on individual clinicians making the effort to incorporate emerging evidence into their practice in the 10-minute consultation windows available to them. There is also a more subtle factor. The finding challenges a framework of dietary thinking that has been dominant for decades, one focused almost exclusively on what is eaten rather than how it is eaten. The carbohydrate content of a meal, the glycemic index of individual foods, the overall dietary pattern, these are the variables around which nutritional guidance is organized, and they are important variables. But the food sequencing research demonstrates that a variable operating entirely orthogonally to all of those, the temporal sequence of macronutrient consumption, can independently produce glucose reductions comparable to meaningful changes in dietary composition. That orthogonality is clinically valuable because it means the intervention adds to the effect of dietary improvements rather than substituting for them. But it also means it does not fit neatly into the existing framework, and findings that require framework revision tend to travel more slowly than those that reinforce existing structures. Within the food sequencing framework, the specific role of fiber consumed prior to carbohydrate deserves particular attention, both because the mechanism is distinct from that of protein or fat, and because the practical implications for meal construction are especially accessible. Soluble fiber, the form found in vegetables, legumes, oats in their intact form, and certain fruits, forms a viscous gel when it comes into contact with water in the digestive tract. This gel creates a physical barrier between the intestinal absorptive surface and the glucose that is subsequently liberated from carbohydrate digestion. The contact time between glucose and the intestinal wall is reduced, the concentration gradient driving glucose absorption is lowered, and the overall rate of glucose entry into the portal circulation is attenuated. The glucose is not prevented from being absorbed, it is absorbed more slowly over a longer period, producing a shallower and more extended glucose curve rather than the sharp peak and subsequent reactive trough that characterizes rapid glucose absorption. Research specifically examining the effect of a pre-meal vegetable course on postprandial glucose has demonstrated consistent reductions in glucose peak values, with effect sizes varying by the type and quantity of vegetables consumed, but generally falling in the range of 15 to 30% compared to the same meal consumed without the vegetable pre-course. Importantly, the effect is not simply an averaging effect from adding low glycemic foods to a high glycemic meal. Studies comparing the glucose response to a pre-meal vegetable course with the same vegetables consumed simultaneously with the carbohydrate have found that the sequence itself, the temporal separation of fiber arrival from carbohydrate arrival, produces additional glucose reduction beyond what the vegetable's nutritional composition alone would predict. The sequence is an independent variable, not merely a proxy for dietary composition. The practical implication is direct. Beginning a meal with a salad, with steamed or raw vegetables, or with a broth-based soup containing vegetables, before consuming the carbohydrate-containing components of the meal, is not simply a strategy for reducing overall caloric intake or improving dietary quality, though it may contribute to both. It is a specific metabolic intervention targeting the rate of glucose absorption through a fiber-mediated gastrointestinal mechanism, with a magnitude of effect that places it among the most impactful, simple dietary adjustments available to someone managing insulin resistance or elevated postprandial glucose. The glucose moderating effect of consuming protein before carbohydrates operates through a different and complementary mechanism, one that involves not the physical properties of the digestive, the tract, but the hormonal signaling system that bridges the gut and the pancreas. When protein arrives at the small intestine, it stimulates the release of incretin hormones, most importantly GLP-1 and glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, or GIP. These hormones travel to the pancreas and stimulate insulin secretion in a glucose-dependent manner, meaning they amplify the insulin response specifically when blood glucose is rising, and are inactive when it is not. They also suppress glucagon, the counter-regulatory hormone that drives hepatic glucose production, and that, when incompletely suppressed after meals in individuals with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, contributes to postprandial hyperglycemia independent of dietary glucose absorption. And critically, GLP-1 directly slows gastric emptying, delaying the arrival of subsequently consumed carbohydrate at the absorptive surface of the small intestine. This mechanism is not peripheral to current metabolic pharmacology, it is central to it. GLP-1 receptor agonists, including semaglutide and liraglutide, are among the most clinically impactful medications currently available for type 2 diabetes and obesity. and they work primarily by replicating the effects of endogenous GLP-1 at supraphysiological concentrations. The food sequencing research is demonstrating that the pattern of eating within a meal, specifically consuming protein before carbohydrate, meaningfully amplifies the body's own GLP-1 response, producing effects through the same hormonal pathway that these medications target, through entirely endogenous means, at zero cost with no side effects, at every meal. This is not an argument that food sequencing replaces pharmacological intervention for individuals who need it. For established type 2 diabetes and significant insulin resistance, the magnitude of benefit from appropriate medication exceeds what dietary sequencing alone can achieve. The point is, the mechanism that the body already possesses the hormonal architecture to moderate postprandial glucose through incretin signaling, and that the sequence in which food is consumed is one of the most direct behavioral variables determining how fully that architecture is activated at each meal. The research on acidic pre-meal consumption extends the food sequencing principle into a domain that has attracted considerable popular attention, sometimes productively and sometimes with the distortion that accompanies rapid adoption by wellness culture. The underlying mechanism is sufficiently well established in the peer-reviewed literature to warrant precise examination separate from the associations it has acquired in less rigorous contexts. Acetic acid, the active component of vinegar, exerts its glucose moderating effect through at least three distinct mechanisms. First, it inhibits salivary and pancreatic amylase, the enzymes responsible for the initial hydrolysis of dietary starch into glucose, reducing the rate at which complex carbohydrates are broken down and therefore the rate at which glucose becomes available for absorption. Second, it reduces the activity of sucrase and maltase in the intestinal brush border, further slowing disaccharide breakdown. Third, it slows gastric emptying through a mechanism that appears to involve activation of vagal nerve pathways. The combined effect is a delay and attenuation of glucose absorption that produces measurably lower postprandial glucose peaks across a range of carbohydrate-containing meals. A meta-analysis published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, pooling data from 11 randomized controlled trials, found that vinegar consumption before or with meals reduced postprandial blood glucose and insulin responses in both healthy individuals and those with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. The effect was consistent across different types of vinegar and different carbohydrate sources, suggesting that the acetic acid mechanism is broadly applicable rather than specific to particular food combinations. The practical application: 1 to 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar or wine vinegar dissolved in a glass of water, consumed 10 to 15 minutes before a carbohydrate-containing meal, is low cost, widely accessible, and for most people without gastrointestinal conditions that would make regular acid consumption inadvisable, without meaningful adverse effects at these quantities. What vinegar does not do is render carbohydrate metabolically neutral. The glucose reduction is an attenuation, not an elimination. It operates best as part of a broader approach, in which food sequencing, vegetables and protein before carbohydrate is the primary intervention, with the pre-meal acid component adding a further degree of amylase inhibition and gastric slowing on top of the gastrointestinal architecture that the sequencing itself establishes. The translation of food sequencing research into daily practice is straightforward in principle, though it requires a degree of deliberate restructuring of meal habits that, while simple, runs counter to how most people in the modern world eat quickly in mixed combinations, with carbohydrate typically forming both the most prominent and the first consumed component of the meal. The framework is three-tiered and applies consistently across meal types and dietary patterns. The first tier is fiber and non-starchy vegetables, consumed before anything else. A salad before the main course, raw or cooked vegetables eaten while the rest of the meal is still being served. A broth or vegetable soup as a starter. Any of these fulfills the mechanical function of establishing the viscous gel layer in the proximal intestine and initiating the slowing of gastric transit. The second tier is protein and fat, consumed after the vegetable course and before the carbohydrate. The protein source, meat, fish, eggs, legumes, dairy, stimulates incretin release amplifies the insulin response, suppresses glucagon, and further slows gastric emptying. The fat component, consumed alongside or following protein, extends the gastric slowing effect and reduces the insulin excursion associated with the subsequent carbohydrate load. The third tier is carbohydrate bread, rice, pasta, potato, fruit, consumed last, arriving at a small intestine whose absorptive capacity has been physically impeded by the fiber layer, whose hormonal environment has been prepared by incretin stimulation, and whose gastric supply rate has been slowed by the protein and fat consumed before it. At breakfast, this translates to eating eggs or Greek yogurt before toast or oatmeal, or to beginning with a small quantity of vegetables if they are available, before consuming the carbohydrate component. At lunch, it means eating the salad before the sandwich, the soup before the bread, the protein component of a bowl meal before the grain. At dinner, it means the vegetable course or salad precedes the pasta, rice, or potato rather than being served alongside or after it. These are not elaborate reconstructions of the meal. They are temporal adjustments, the same food consumed in a different order, producing a fundamentally different metabolic outcome. The glucose spike that follows eating is not simply a function of what is in the meal. It is a function of when each component of the meal arrives at the small intestine, what hormonal environment has been established before it arrives, and what physical barriers to rapid absorption have been put in place by what was eaten first. Every meal is, in this sense, a sequence of decisions, and the research is clear that the sequence matters as much as the content. This is the trick that nobody talks about. Not because it does not work, because nobody has explained clearly and specifically enough why it does.